Max for Cats.
Hello and welcome to Digital by Max for Cats. Digital is a Max for Life synthesizer which combines different techniques of synthesis, and it will help you to create very exciting digital sounds. I want to give you a quick overview of its features and functions in order that you can create your own sounds. So first of all, Digital has two oscillators, and you can switch the oscillators with the oscillator type button switch here, and you can see with the color already which oscillator type you're looking at and which oscillator you're editing. So if we stick to the first oscillator and look at the left hand side, you will see the waveform display and some presets for some waveforms, which you can click, and you will see that the display changes according to the preset, and the sound of course too. But you can create way more complex waveforms with Digital because it has these four boxes. And what you can see here is four boxes, where the first box has 20 harmonics, meaning 20 sine wave oscillators, where you can simply add sine waves with adding and clicking into these boxes and changing the slider values. This will generate a spectrum which is read in as a wavetable for the oscillator, and the oscillator will read out the wavetable. So you can also modulate whatever spectrum you have generated with some frequency modulation, and that's what the second box is for. And you have also like a strength for the modulation. That's like the definition, like 1 times, 2 times, 4 times, and 8 times. And if we look at our sine wave and change the frequency modulation for the first sine wave, you will see that the sine wave changes 4 times if the factor 4 is turned on, and it will change 8 times if the factor 8 is turned on. So that lets you create very complex waveforms already, from very digital sounding to very organic sounding sounds. So you have two of these oscillators, and at the bottom you see the phases. So if we go back to the sine wave, we can shift the phase of the sine wave by changing the value of the bottom slider, and the sine wave will shift its phase. Same for the phases for the frequency modulation, so you can shift the phase of the frequency modulation. So you can just experiment with these four boxes and generate a lot of different waveforms and see how they sound, because you can already hear them all the time when you play it. You can see them, and you can also modulate the spectrum as a wavetable with either LFOs or an ADSR envelope. For the ADSR envelope, you have a big button here at the left hand side, and if you turn it on, you will hear that this ADSR style envelope will generate nicely digital PPG style sounds. And we right now hear just one oscillator without modulation, so if you modulate the whole stuff, you will get very exciting sounds. Next to the sound generators, the sound generation part, we see the LFOs, the filter, and the envelopes. We have two LFOs. The LFOs can be synced to the global tempo. You can define an LFO waveform. You can set the speed from 0 to 40 Hz. You have a little window where you can see the modulation, and you have a phase switch. When it's turned on, it will define that on each note on message, the phase will be restarted, and you can set the start position of the phase with the phase knob. The filter is a state variable SVF type filter, and you have low pass, band pass, high pass, and notch, cutoff and resonance, envelope amount, and mix amount, which mixes the filtered signal with the unfiltered signal. It's very nice if you have a high pass filter and you want to still have some low end, then you just mix in a little bit of dry signal, unfiltered signal. We have 4 envelopes for the amplitude, filter, pitch, and modulation. The pitch envelope can be inverted so that the pitch goes from up to down and not from down to up, and so on. Next, we have a global volume where you can define the whole outgoing volume. By clicking the arrow icon, we have access to additional features. In this case, we have a modulation matrix, some built-in effects, a sub-oscillator with frequency modulation, a sequencer, and some system settings. So let's start with the modulation matrix. If we, for example, want to modulate the filter with LFO1, we'd simply choose LFO1 from the drop-down menu and modulate the filter with the filter amount. A nice thing is that you can also use the summed output of LFO1 and 2 as modulation, or the multiplied output. That will give you more variable waveforms to modulate with, and it is very interesting to do so. Next, we will have a look at the built-in effects. We have an EQ. It has 3 bands, and you can change the width of the band and the amount of equalization. And there's a reset button to reset it. Whatever you adjust here, it will be saved with a sound as a preset, and that's very useful because you can carve out unwanted frequencies, or you can shape some overtones a little bit more clearly, etc. So it's a very nice addition to the whole sound. Also, there's a chorus, which will add some richness and fatness to the sound. And it has 3 buttons, so there is not much to adjust apart from the volume and some dry wet amount. And it will help you to generate more warm type of sounds with the digital synthesizer. Let's now have a look at the sub-oscillator and frequency modulation section. The sub-oscillator is very unique because it generates some sort of super saw sounds, and let's have a listen how this sounds. Which is especially nice if you detune it. I advise to turn it off if you don't need it, because it takes considerable CPU amounts, but that's up to your machine. Next, we have the frequency modulation section, which is different from the frequency modulation section we have seen before, because it completely modulates the whole output of the oscillators, and you can also modulate the spectrum of oscillator 1 with oscillator 2. So if you just use the sine wave, it will sound like this. And if you use oscillator 2 as modulator, can do very exciting sounds. Next, we have a saturation stage, which gives you some distortion. Which is especially useful for nasty bass sounds. A very powerful feature of the digital synthesizer is the sequencer. The sequencer is a modulation step sequencer or a note sequencer. Let's have a look at the modulation step sequencer first. This one is always active. You don't need to activate it. You just need to use it as a source in the modulation matrix. So if you want, for example, to control the filter frequency with the modulation step sequencer, simply choose it as a modulation source in the modulation matrix. As you can see, the sequencer can run forward, backward, alternate or random, and you can change the amount of the steps with the sliders. Another feature is of course the note sequencing. In order to do so, just go to the note section and hit activate run, and that means that the sequence is active. This is also indicated with a little lock icon. So what happens now is each incoming note will be transposed up or down with a step sequence. You can also mute certain steps. You can have velocity. You can change the speed. And there's a humanizer function. Also, you can change the step lengths. And you can randomize for each of the steps with the randomize slider and the randomize function. In the system settings, you can set some global preferences. For example, the oscillator readout interpolation. You can choose between A, B, and C, where A means no interpolation, B means linear high quality interpolation, and C means Hermite interpolation. If you choose C as an interpolation method, you can also adjust the tension and bias parameters depending on what you prefer. You might get a harsh sounder or not so harsh sounding oscillator readout. Below that, you have a monophonic polyphonic section, and you can choose how many voices you will play, from monophonic up to 8 voices. You have a stereo switch with a stereo spread. The stereo spread works like this, that each note on will be placed randomly in the stereo section, and the more value you give the stereo spread, the more wide the panning will be from each voice. The pitch bend allows up to 24 semitones pitch bend range, and the glissando has up to, I think, 2 seconds of glissando. You can also adjust the velocity to filter envelope, and there's a built-in peak limiter to avoid volume boosts, but that's up to the sound and up to you to decide.